All right, welcome back. We're going through C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, a bus ride that goes from hell to heaven, and each ghost gets a chance to decide if they want to stay in heaven or go back down, down, down. We just finished chapter 9, which was a really long chapter, but now we're in chapter 10, so let's start reading. This conversation also was overheard. "This is quite out of the question," said a female ghost to one of the bright women. "I should not dream of staying if I am expected to meet Robert. I am ready to forgive him, of course, but nothing more is quite impossible. How he comes to be here, but that is your affair." "But if you have forgiven him," said the other, "surely—" "I forgive him as a Christian," said the ghost, "but there are some things one can never forget." "But I don't understand," began the she-spirit. "Exactly. That," said the ghost with a little laugh. "You never did. You always thought Robert could do no wrong. I know. Please don't interrupt for one moment. You haven't the faintest conception of what I have went through with your dear Robert. The ingratitude. It was I who made a man out of him, sacrificed my whole life to him, and what was my reward? Absolute, utter selfishness. No, but listen, he was potting along at about 600 a year when I married him, and mark my words, Hilda, he'd have been in that position to the day of his death if he hadn't been for me. It was I who had to drive him every step of the way. He hadn't a spark of ambition. It was like trying to lift a sack of coal. I had to positively nag him to take on that extra work in the other department, though it was really the beginning of everything for him. The laziness of men. He said, if you please, he couldn't work more than 13 hours a day. As if I weren't working far longer. For my day's work wasn't over when his was. I had to keep him going all evening, if you understand what I mean. If he had had his way, he'd have just sat in the armchair and sulked when dinner was over. It was I who had to draw him out of himself and brighten him up and make conversation, with no help from him, of course. And sometimes he didn't even listen, as I said to him. I should have thought good manners, if nothing else. He seemed to have forgotten that I was even a lady, if I had married him, and all the time I was working my fingers to the bone for him, and without the slightest appreciation. I used to spend simply hours arranging flowers to make that poky little house nice, and instead of thanking me, what do you think he said? Said he wished I wouldn't fill up the writing desk with them when he wanted to use it, and there was a perfectly faithful fuss one evening because I had spilled one of the vases over some papers of his. It was all nonsense, really, because they weren't anything to do with his work. He had some silly idea of writing a book in those days, as if he could. I cured him of that in the end. No, Hilda, you must listen to me. The trouble I went to, entertaining. Robert's idea was that he'd just slink off by himself every now and then to see what he called his old friends, and leave me to amuse myself. But I knew from the first that those friends were doing him no good. No, Robert, I said, your friends are now mine. It is my duty to have them here, however tired I am and however little we can afford it. You'd have thought that would have been enough, but they did come for a bit, and that's where I had to use a certain amount of tact. A woman who has her wits about her can always drop in a word here and there. I wanted Robert to see them against a different background. They weren't quite at their ease somehow in my drawing room, nor at their best. I couldn't help laughing sometimes. Of course, Robert was uncomfortable while the treatment was going on, But it was all for his own good in the end. None of that set were friends of his any longer by the end of the first year. And then he got that new job, a great step up. But what do you think? Instead of realizing that we now had a chance to spread out a bit, all he said was, "Well, now, for God's sake, let's have some peace." That nearly finished me. I nearly gave him up altogether. But I knew my duty. I have always done my duty. You can't believe the work I had getting him to agree to a bigger house, and then finding a house. I wouldn't have grudged it one scrap if only he'd taken it in the right spirit, if only he'd seen the fun of it all. If he had been a different sort of a man, it would have been fun meeting him on the doorstep as he came back from the office and saying, "Come along, Bob's no time for dinner tonight. I've just heard of a house near Watford, and I've got the keys, and we can get there and back by 1 o'clock." With him, it was perfect misery, Hilda. For by this time, your wonderful Robert was turning into the sort of man who cares about nothing but food. Well, I got him into a new house at last. Yes, I know it was a little more than we could really afford at the moment, but all sorts of things were opening up out before him, and of course I began to entertain properly. No more of his sort of friends, thank you. I was doing it all for his sake. Every useful friend he ever made was due to me. Naturally, I had to dress well. They ought to have been the happiest years of both of our lives. If they weren't, he had no one but himself to thank. Oh, he was just a maddening man, simply maddening. He just set himself to get old and silent and grumpy, just sank into himself. He could have looked years younger if he had taken the trouble. He needn't have walked with a stoop. I'm sure I warned him about that often enough. He was the most miserable host. Whenever we gave a party, everything rested on my shoulders. Robert was simply a wet blanket. I said to him, and if I said it once, I said it 100 times. He hadn't always been like that. There had been a time when he took an interest in all sorts of things and had been quite ready to make friends. "What on earth is coming over you?" I used to say. But now he just didn't answer at all. He would sit staring at me with his big eyes. I came to hate a man with dark eyes. And I know it now, just hating me. That was my reward after all I had done. Sheer wicked, senseless hatred at the very moment when he was a richer man than he'd ever dreamed of being. As I used to say to him, "Robert, you're simply letting yourself go to seed." The younger men who came to the house, it wasn't my fault that they liked me better than my old bear of a husband used to laugh at him. I did my duty to the very end. I forced him to take exercise, and that was really my chief reason for keeping a Great Dane. I kept on giving parties. I took him for the most wonderful holidays. I saw that he didn't drink too much even when things became desperate. I encouraged him to take up his writing again. It couldn't do any harm by then. How could I help it if he did have a nervous breakdown in the end? My conscience is clear. I've done my duty to him if ever a woman has. So you see why he would be impossible to... And yet, I don't know. I believe I have changed my mind. I'll make them a fair offer, Hilda. I will not meet him, if it means just meeting him and no more. But if I am given a free hand, I'll take charge of him again. I will take up my burden once more. But I must have a free hand. With all the time one would have here, I believe I could make something of him. Somewhere quite to ourselves. Wouldn't that be a good plan? He's not fit to be on his own. Put me in charge of him. He wants firm handling. I know him better than you do. What's that? No. Give him to me, do you hear? Don't consult him. Just give him to me. I'm his wife, aren't I? I was only beginning. There's lots of things I still want to do with him. Now listen, Hilda, please, please. I'm so miserable I must have someone to do things to. It's simply frightful down there. No one minds about me at all. I can't alter them. It's dreadful to see them all sitting about and not able to do anything about them. Give him back to me. Why should I? Why should he have everything his way? It's no good for him. It's not right. It's not fair. I want Robert. What right have you to keep him from me? I hate you. How can I pay him out of if you won't let me have him? The ghost, which had towered up like a dying candle flame, snapped suddenly. A sour, dry smell lingered in the air for a moment, and then there was no ghost to be seen. And that's the end of chapter 10.